impact speaking for African Americans in the United States. But I believe that true Pan-Africanism should not only be reactionary, it should rather be a pace-setting ideology that is focused on promoting the dignity and virtue of Africans wherever they are and controlling the narrative in the polity. We cannot but acknowledge the great imperialist movements of individuals who have made tremendous efforts in capturing the realities of modern Pan-Africanism and champion the post-colonial struggle. And some of those people we talk about include Martin Delany, Edward Wilmot, Marcus Garvey, and for you young people, if you don't know these names, you should go and look them up. W.E.B. Du Bois, Kwame Nkrumah, Fela Kuti, Muammar Gaddafi, that may be someone you have heard in more contemporary times, and Nelson Mandela. But he also feels it's important to note that Pan-Africanism is a genetic ideology that defines the history and common destiny of all Africans and have manifested in cultural, economic, social, and political forms over the years. His next section deals with, his view of Pan-Africanism represents the complexities of Black political and intellectual thought over 200 years, and the Pan-Africanism movement changes according to whether the focus is on politics, ideology, organizations, or culture. It is a belief that African people, both on the African continent and in the diaspora, share not merely a common history, but a common destiny. So, even though from his view that definition is not conclusive, it's important. The next thing he talks about is the historical economic activities of Africa. And it's a long discussion about the economic and social developments that were in place even before the Europeans came. But because the Europeans came, they had to, I guess, appropriate some of these things. And he even goes into a discussion of how the Europeans, when they left Africa, when they left the continent, also appropriated a lot of the written history and artifacts, cultural artifacts of the Africans, and but the Africans were painted as being uncivilized and unsophisticated and all of those negative things. But at the same time, the Europeans refused to return those archival documents, the artwork from these uncivilized, uncouth people. So for him, that too tells a story. And it's a story that he said, Africans in the diaspora need to claim and reclaim and take hold of. Because by separating those of us of African descent from our historical archives, then we also we have bought into the narrative sometimes created by the Europeans. And it has also caused some divisions between people of African descent. So that's kind of what he's looking at in terms of the disillusioned history of African civilization. And he's challenging us to look at some of the salient issues that have come to bear on the current day situation, and this whole notion of Africa being undeveloped or less developed. And some of that is attributable to the Europeans raping and stealing and pillaging the resources, and we see that continuation of that kind of behavior today. So he tries to make, he does make a connection between that. And I think one of the profound things is he talks about the Eurocentric threat. And that Eurocentric threat, it's an ideology that posits the superiority of European customs, their values, and their history above other societies, and it seeks to explain European dominance within the global capitalist system. So he sees this as this racial misunderstanding assumes that European society as civilized, developed, modern, and superior, while in its view, Africans are backwards, undeveloped, crude, and barbarians. So that kind of narrative has also seeped into the intellectual discussion, especially the conceptualization of modernization, colonialism, imperialist ideology, and all of those things. So the Europeans, he argued, ignores the role played by colonialism and the slave trade in the underdevelopment of Africa. And there's a significant figure, at least from political science, Rodney, just had a senior moment. Right, yeah, and he talks about how Europe underdeveloped Africa, so that's right, yeah, Walter Rodney. So that's kind of the take he has on that. And then he looks at the Afro-historic amnesia. And we can relate that to in Mississippi because of the plantation system and the role of cotton well, I wouldn't say just Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, throughout the South. We sometimes have amnesia too. And that we bought into this European narrative rather than, seeing ourselves as connected in some way in the connections. I was thinking of Mother Luna when she was talking. A lot of what he said in this paper, you were saying, making the connection, between Mississippi or between the South, really, and Africa. He also talks about, and this is significant, some of the modern day forms of slavery. And those include, forced labor, debt bondage, and here we talk about the plantation system here in the U.S., and we talk about the sharecropping system where, you never finish paying the folk. You just were working to be worthy, and your basic needs were not really met. Bonded labor, and something we see a lot in today's time, human trafficking, especially of women and girls. And then we see a lot of also forced labor in terms of people who were brought into this country. I'm thinking particularly you have a lot of Asians who are forced to come to this country. They're food and they're literally in bondage. And then you have a lot of young girls and women who are forced into prostitution and all those kinds of things. So he's talking about that. And he's pretty even-handed because he even talks about the incident and the high rate of human suffering and bondage on the continent. And he gives some statistics, particular in terms of some of the northern African countries as well as Nigeria and places like Benin and Mali in terms of human bondage and forced labor. Eritrea is mentioned, Burundi, the Central African Republic, and the numbers are astonishing in terms of the millions of people who are in this form of slavery. So then he talks, I guess the other part, he talks some about the recent history of Africa and some of the contributions they've made to the world in terms of art, in terms of education, in terms of the medical field, and all of those things, and sports, and the idea that there are a lot of things that we should pay attention to that are contributions for people of African descent to the building of America and of European societies. Finally, he says he wants to, Dr. Sade Cassie Turnipseed, who pioneered and ensured the sustainability of this invertebrate symposium, Africa will continually drink from this well of information and wisdom. So in terms of his comparative study of Mississippi and Lagos, he talks about one of the places he likes to visit when he's bored, and that place is Pura Digest. He says, I get updates on very important and sometimes sarcastic questions and answers that somebody has volunteered to provide, particularly Africa. So he says, during one of his routine visits, he stumbled on a question: what's normal in Mississippi, but weird in other states? This is the answer I got from a person named Jennifer Bennett, who studied media marketing at Antonelli College, and I guess this is connected to the University of Southern Mississippi because he has Hattiesburg, Mississippi in here, so I don't know what the connection is there, but and her response is, Mississippi has quite a few little idiosyncrasies, but the two big ones I've noticed are the obsession with boiled peanuts and a marked use of condescending politeness. I love how people from Mississippi are so polite while still being complete and total assholes, and I'm reading this. A quick bless your heart from somebody's grandma and you've been told off. A smile and your mama must be proud instantly feels like you should stop breathing. While you can see polite attitudes in other southern states like Georgia and Alabama, Mississippi has the trademark. So he says, I don't know the extent that this statement is true, but assuming it is true, how do we explain the obsession of boiled peanuts in Mississippi while we cannot explain our obsession for ground peanuts in southern Nigeria? West Africa has grown different species of ground nuts before the Portuguese brought other species of peanuts to Africa from Brazil in the 1600s. However, the slave trade era witnessed the first movement of peanuts out of Africa to the Caribbean and the American South. The majority went through Lagos. The shift in the African economies and perhaps in the modern economic era was pioneered by the true export trade of peanuts, which started in the early 1800s. The principal market then was Great Britain, but Americans dominated the market from 1837 to 1848. Though the British were not good consumers of peanuts, but the Americans loved to eat peanuts. This, I hope, explains the love for peanuts in Mississippi. Presently, Nigeria is the largest producer of peanuts in Africa, with 3 million tons produced in northern Nigeria, consumed and exported through southern Nigeria, the coastal region which borders the Atlantic Ocean and the trade route. So just as we commemorate the great virtues of cotton pickers in Mississippi today, we must not forget that some of them were peanut farmers who were sold as slaves and left the shores of Africa through Lagos, Nigeria, and found themselves in Europe and Mississippi today. Peanuts could have been a significant cultural heritage that we should consider. Secondly, I also try to understand where the condescending politeness of the good people of Mississippi came from. Africans have deeply rooted family values of politeness and respect, especially to the elders. In Nigeria, where I come from, apart from my biological parents, every other elder in my community were involved in my upbringing, training, and motivation. We know something about that if you're over 50. That is why Africa raises balanced and respectful kids. Every adult reserves the right to discipline or correct erring children whenever and wherever they are found wanting, provided their parents are not there to discipline them. He tells a story of a few years ago of a family who relocated their teenage son from the United States back to Nigeria to live with the grandparents because the child was considered wayward. He was becoming Americanized, I guess, and lacked African culture, the African culture of respect and regard for adults. He spent 4 years in Nigeria and was shaped, I love this terminology, was shaped to a proper African cultured young man before he went back to the United States. He is presently a medical doctor, and we hear stories of his transformation and good behavior ever since. This is who we are as Africans, and Jennifer's submission resonates well with the society that I come from. Lastly, I could also read the religiosity of Mississippi people in her submission. May I kindly remind you that Africans are known to be very religious. It was easy for the missionaries to penetrate Africa with the gospel because they met on ground a religious structure that was adaptable to whatever religion they were bringing. For example, my surname, which is my grandfather's name, is Osasona. The prefix of the name Orissa, which is shortened to Osa, means a supreme being. And you may have heard this in some of the Brazilian, Afro-Brazilian stories. Orissa is a corn person being. The suffix Siona, shortened to Sona, means to make a way. A combination of the two. Osasona means the supreme being made a way. Of course, my father could relate to this name when Christianity taught him about a God that makes a way. My name is Oletimi, which means God is my support. A proper Nigerian indigenous name is always attached to a supreme being, and he has in parentheses God. So he talks some more about the massive shipment of millions of slaves to America to work on the plantations, with the typical one being the cotton plantation, and he gives some data about the percentage that came across the Atlantic in the 19th century during the slave trade. More than 3.5 million slaves were shipped from Nigeria to the Americas. Most of those slaves were, and he gives their ethnic identity, was Igbo, Yoruba, that occupied the southern part of Nigeria. And then he talks about this place in Nigeria, Bakari, where the slave ships came to pick up the slaves, and they were taken from there and eventually to the United States. And then he ends with a series of initiatives that he invites or he challenges us. He calls a wake-up call for people of African descent, regardless of their geographical locations and circumstances of migration, to engage Africa positively and to contribute to the development of Africa in specific ways. Included among that, he talks about the African Union Agenda for 2063. The African, and it's called The Africa We Want, is the title. This is a strategic framework for the socio-economic transformation of the continent over the next 50 years. It builds on and seeks to accelerate the implementation of past and existing continental initiatives for growth and sustainable development. I believe our common destiny lies in this carefully crafted document, and I invite you all to study the framework outlined in the document. Identify a place where you all fit in and begin to make deliberate contributions toward the prosperous Africa we all want. I invite you to begin to invest in the younger generations of Africa who will shoulder the realization of the Agenda 2063. Africa has the brightest minds you can think of. You may wish to invest in the education sector, health, economy, entertainment, and creative industries, and more importantly, begin to play a mentoring role for young Africans. He says, 23rd of August is the day designated by UNESCO as International Day for the commemoration of slavery and its abolition. Beyond marking this day, I invite you all to partner with African countries, governments, and agencies in the campaign against modern-day slavery and be actively involved in combating the menace in all of its guises. The African entertainment and creative industries have done tremendously well in telling African stories, which we are beginning to shape the image of Africa positively with robust regional collaboration. Nollywood is a multi-million-dollar booming industry in Nigeria and throughout Africa. I invite you to invest in this sector and partner with the professionals to tell your beautiful story and to move the industry to the next level and shape the image of Africa. There's a couple of more. Let's see one more. It says, finally, the media wants you to believe, it doesn't sound like Donald Trump now, the media wants you to believe their inaccurate narrative of Africa. I encourage you to visit Africa and to see for yourself how well we have fared in our present challenges. This will help shape your opinion about Africa. Commit yourselves to the development of the African continent and change the narrative of Africa that is being propagated by the media. Thank you all for listening. God bless Africa and God bless America.